The year was 1879, and the autumn was dying a slow, hard death across the high plains. For Ezra Blackwood, it felt like a mirror to his own soul. The land around his small, isolated homestead was leached of color, the grasses brittle and bleached to the color of old bone under a sky that was a vast, indifferent sheet of gray. Each morning he rose before the sun had summoned the courage to breach the horizon, and the cold was a physical thing that seeped through the chinked logs of his cabin and settled deep into his marrow. It was a cold that had lived inside him for more than a year now, ever since the fever had come and taken everything that mattered. He moved through his days with the mechanical precision of a man running on memory alone. The swing of the axe as it bit into pine logs was a familiar rhythm, the shudder in his arms, a known sensation. He mended the fences that defined the edges of his world, his fingers, raw and chapped, working the wire with a practiced numbness. He tended to his 2 gaunt cows and half-dozen chickens, their small noises the only answer to the oppressive silence that had claimed the property as its own. This place, once vibrant with the laughter of his wife Abigail and the shouting games of their son, Samuel, was now just a collection of buildings held together by duty and haunted by echoes. The cabin itself was the heart of the emptiness. It was too large for one man. Abigail's rocking chair still sat by the hearth, its wood smooth and dark from her touch, but it never moved. Samuel's small, whittled bird, a lopsided thing with a perpetually surprised expression, remained on the mantelpiece, a sentinel of a life that had been stolen. Ezra found his gaze skittering away from these objects, his mind shying from the memories they held like a horse from a flame. The grief was not a sharp, fresh wound anymore. It had become a landscape, the very ground on which he walked, vast and unchangeable. Outside, on a small rise overlooking the unforgiving plains, were 2 wooden crosses. He had carved their names himself, his hands shaking so badly the letters were almost illegible. He did not go there. He could not. Isolation had become his shield. The nearest town was a full day's ride, and he made the journey only when supplies ran so low that necessity overrode his profound disinterest in the world of men. He had listened to the talk in the general store, the fearful, hateful words spit like tobacco juice about the Cheyenne, whose lands this had once been. They were called savages, specters that haunted the edges of civilization. Ezra had absorbed this prejudice without question, the way a man absorbs the chill of the air. It was a distant fear, an abstraction, for he had never encountered any of the local tribes. He preferred it that way. He wanted nothing from the world, and he wanted the world to ask nothing of him. He was a man whittled down to the core, living a life of quiet resignation, waiting for a winter that he suspected might finally claim him as it had claimed his family. Then the sky turned. The indifferent gray thickened and curdled into a bruised purple-black that swallowed the horizon. The wind, which had been a constant mournful sigh, began to shriek. It was not a normal storm. This was a monster, a white beast of legend that descended from the mountains with a sudden, shocking ferocity. The air filled with a blinding torrent of snow, driven horizontally by the gale. It was a physical assault, erasing the world, burying the familiar lines of his fences and barn under a churning sea of white. Ezra was fighting his way back from the barn, the wind tearing the breath from his lungs when he saw it. Through the maelstrom, a shape, dark and unsteady, stumbled against the storm's fury. It was a human figure, staggering, falling, rising again, a desperate, losing battle against the elements. It reached his fence line, a mere 50 yards from the cabin, and then collapsed into a heap, disappearing almost instantly into a fresh drift. His first instinct was a cold knot of fear and suspicion. In this land, a stranger was more often a threat than a godsend. It could be a thief, a desperado, someone drawn by the lonely plume of smoke from his chimney. The part of him that had grown hard and insular screamed to bar the door, to let the storm have whomever it was. It was not his concern. He had learned the cruel lesson that survival was a solitary affair. But then, an image of Abigail's face, her expression of deep, unwavering compassion, flickered in his mind. He saw Samuel, small and helpless in his final hours. He cursed under his breath, the words stolen by the wind. He could not leave a man to die, not like this. It was a line he had not yet crossed. Wrapping his scarf tighter around his face, he leaned into the blizzard and forced his way toward the fallen shape. The snow was already waist-deep in the drifts, a thick, heavy powder that fought his every step. He found the man half buried, his face pressed into the snow. With numb fingers, Ezra brushed the snow away and turned him over. The man's face was stark and angular, his skin the color of burnished copper, his long black hair matted with ice. He was Cheyenne. His buckskin clothing was thin and offered little protection against such a gale. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow, a faint wisp of vapor in the frigid air. There were no weapons visible, no rifle or bow. The storm had likely stripped them from him. He was just a man freezing to death at the edge of Ezra's world. With a grunt of exertion that was part physical effort and part groan of reluctant spirit, Ezra hoisted the man into a fireman's carry. The dead weight was immense, and Ezra's own body, weary from grief and meager rations, screamed in protest. He fought his way back to the cabin, step by agonizing step, the howling wind trying to rip the man from his shoulders. He kicked the door open and half fell inside, dropping his burden onto the rough-hewn floorboards before slamming the door shut, cutting off the shriek of the storm. The sudden silence of the cabin was deafening, broken only by his own ragged gasps and the crackle of the fire in the hearth. He had brought the wilderness inside. He had brought the unknown into the heart of his sanctuary of sorrow, and he had no idea if he had just saved a life or sealed his own fate. For a long moment, Ezra stood over the unconscious form, his breath clouding in the cold air of the cabin. The man was a specter from the stories in town, a living embodiment of the fear and mistrust he had passively accepted. Yet, on the floor, he looked only like a man defeated by the elements. His strength, whatever it might have been, was gone. He was vulnerable. With a sigh of resignation, Ezra dragged him closer to the fire, the heat drawing a faint steam from his frozen clothes. He worked with a grim, functional purpose, his movements detached. He pulled off the man's stiff, ice-encrusted moccasins, revealing feet that were a pale, alarming white. He chafed them gently with a coarse wool blanket, trying to bring life back into the frozen flesh, the entire time feeling a profound sense of unreality. He covered the man with every spare blanket he owned, piling them high, creating a cocoon of warmth. He did not know the man's name, his story, or his intent. He only knew the imperative of a human life flickering before him, and the ghost of his wife whispering that this was the right thing to do. The stranger remained unconscious through the rest of the day and into the night. The blizzard did not relent. It laid siege to the small cabin, rattling the window panes and piling snow against the walls with a relentless, soft pressure. Ezra sat in his chair, the rifle across his lap, and watched. He watched the slow rise and fall of the blankets, the gradual return of a healthier color to the man's exposed cheekbones. He did not sleep. He existed in a state of high alert, a guardian to a man who might be his enemy. Sometime in the gray hours before dawn, the man stirred. His eyes opened. They were dark, intelligent, and filled with a deep, bottomless suspicion. He took in his surroundings in a single, sweeping glance: the log walls, the meager furnishings, the fire, and finally, Ezra. The warrior's instinct was plain to see, his body tensed, ready for a fight, even in its weakened state. Ezra held up a hand, palm open, a universal gesture he hoped would be understood. He kept his movements slow and deliberate, setting the rifle aside, but keeping it within reach. The air in the small room was thick with unspoken questions and primal caution. Neither man moved for a long time. They were two poles of a world that rarely met in peace, forced into a fragile truce by the howling fury of nature. Finally, Ezra rose and ladled some thin broth from the pot, simmering over the fire, into a bowl. He approached the man cautiously and offered it. The warrior's eyes narrowed, searching Ezra's face for any sign of treachery. After a long, tense moment, he gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. Ezra helped him sit up, his back against a rolled-up blanket. The man took the bowl in unsteady hands and drank, the warm liquid a small miracle in the frozen world. He finished it and handed the bowl back, another curt nod his only thanks. And so their strange cohabitation began. The blizzard raged for 2 more days, imprisoning them in the small cabin. Silence was the third occupant of the room, heavy and watchful. They communicated through necessity, with gestures and glances. When Ezra needed more firewood from the pile inside, the man would shift his legs out of the way. When the man coughed, a dry, rattling sound, Ezra would offer him water. They were like 2 wary animals sharing a cave, aware of each other's every breath, every movement. Ezra found himself studying the man. He had a quiet dignity, a stillness that seemed at odds with the violent stories he'd heard. The man, in turn, watched Ezra with an unnerving intensity, his gaze missing nothing. The storm's relentless assault began to wear on Ezra, the confinement stirring the grief he tried so hard to keep buried. On the 3rd night, the wind howled with a particular human-like sorrow, and it found an echo in his own heart. He sat staring at the fire, his defenses crumbling, when his eyes fell upon the little whittled bird on the mantelpiece. He saw Samuel's small, earnest face, his tongue stuck out in concentration as he carved it. He saw Abigail smiling, her hands dusted with flour. The loss was suddenly as sharp and as cold as the blizzard outside. He did not realize he was crying, a single, silent tear tracking a path through the grime on his cheek, until he felt a presence beside him. The Cheyenne man had moved, with a quietness that was startling, to stand near his chair. He did not speak, he simply looked at the wooden bird, then back at Ezra's face. In his dark eyes there was not pity, but a flicker of profound, shared understanding. He reached out and placed a hand on Ezra's shoulder. The touch was brief, firm, and astonishingly grounding. It was a gesture that transcended language and culture, a simple acknowledgement of pain, man to man, sufferer to sufferer. Then he withdrew his hand and returned to his place by the fire. The gesture broke something open in the silent cabin. The tension did not vanish, but it changed, softening at the edges. The next morning, Ezra found a tear in the man's buckskin tunic, near the shoulder. On impulse, he retrieved Abigail's sewing kit. He held up the needle and thread, a questioning look on his face. The man watched him for a moment, then nodded and slipped the tunic off, revealing a physique corded with muscle and laced with old scars. Ezra sat and stitched the garment, his fingers clumsy at first, but the simple, domestic act felt meaningful. It was an act of mending, not just for the cloth, but for something else, something intangible between them. When he was finished, he handed it back. The man examined the repair, then looked at Ezra and spoke for the first time. His voice was a low rasp. "Vokin." He touched his own chest. "Ezra," he replied, touching his own. "A name." It was a fragile bridge, but it was a start. Later that day, Vokin, using a combination of gestures and a few more halting words, conveyed that he had been part of a hunting party, tracking buffalo, when the blizzard had struck and separated him from the others. He pointed to his heart, then drew 2 small figures in the air beside a larger one, a family. He, too, had something to lose. The following day, Vokin picked up a piece of firewood and, using a small, sharp stone he'd found by the hearth, began to carve. Ezra watched, fascinated, as a shape emerged from the wood under his skilled hands. His fingers, which Ezra had assumed were only for weapons or hard labor, moved with a surprising delicacy and grace. Over several hours, he carved a small, detailed figure of a wolf, its head raised as if howling at the moon. When he was done, he polished it smooth with ash and held it out to Ezra. It was a gift. A repayment for the mended tunic, for the broth, for a life. Ezra took it, the wood still warm in his hand. He placed it on the mantelpiece, next to Samuel's bird. The two carvings, one of a bird and one of a wolf, one made by a boy and one by a warrior, stood together in the firelight. The silence in the cabin was no longer empty. It was filled with a quiet, growing respect. On the fourth morning, they awoke to a world transformed. The wind had died, and an eerie, brilliant silence had fallen. Ezra opened the door to a landscape of impossible beauty and danger. The snow was piled in immense, sculpted drifts, glittering under a sun that seemed shockingly bright in a clean, blue sky. The world was reborn in white. Vokin stood beside him, his gaze sweeping the horizon. He was still weak, but his strength was returning. He looked at Ezra and nodded, a clear indication that it was time for him to leave, to find his people. Ezra felt a strange pang of something he could not name. Reluctance? He had grown accustomed to the man's quiet presence, a buffer against the crushing loneliness. But before Vokin could make a move, a new sound broke the profound stillness. It was the crunch of boots on snow, and then harsh, rough laughter. Three men on horseback were picking their way through the drifts, drawn by the wisp of smoke from Ezra's chimney. They were hard-looking men, their faces chapped red by the wind, their eyes small and greedy. The man in the lead, a tall, rangy individual with a cruel twist to his mouth, dismounted with an air of arrogant ownership. "Well now, look what we have here," the leader said, his voice grating. Someone cozy and warm while honest folks nearly freeze. His eyes swept over Ezra's meager farm, then flickered to the cabin door, where he saw Vokin standing just inside. His expression changed, a predatory gleam entering his eyes. "Well, well, hiding a redskin, are you, farmer?" Ezra's blood ran cold. He knew this type of man. Garrett Vance was his name, a claim jumper and sometime bounty hunter, whose reputation for casual brutality was well known in the nearest town. "He's just a traveler, caught in the storm," Ezra said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his gut. He positioned himself squarely in the doorway, blocking their view. Vance chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "A traveler? That's a funny word for it. There's a bounty on any Cheyenne buck caught off their reservation land. $5. Not much, but enough for a bottle and a warm meal." He gestured to his companions. "Hand him over. We're cold and hungry, and we ain't in a mood to argue." The moment hung in the crystalline air, sharp and fragile. Everything in Ezra's past this fear, his ingrained prejudice, his desire to be left alone, told him to step aside. It was the easy path, the safe one. Hand over the stranger, and these men would likely take some food and leave. It was a simple transaction of survival. But then he thought of the shared silence, the quiet understanding in Vokin's eyes, the hand on his shoulder, the small carved wolf on his mantle. He thought of the debt he now felt, not of obligation, but of shared humanity. He had shared his fire with this man. He had seen his dignity. He could not now sell him for $5. Ezra's resolve hardened, solidifying into something he had not felt in over a year: purpose. He looked Vance straight in the eye, his own gaze as cold and unyielding as the winter landscape. "No," he said, the single word clear and final. Vance's smirk faltered, replaced by a flash of angry disbelief. "What did you say?" "I said no," Ezra repeated, his voice gaining strength. "He was freezing to death. He's under my roof and under my protection. You'll not lay a hand on him." The air crackled with tension. Vance's two companions shifted uneasily on their horses, their hands moving toward their sidearms. Inside the cabin, Ezra heard a faint metallic sound. He knew without looking that Vokin had armed himself with the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. He was not alone in this. "You'd choose a savage over your own kind," Vance sneered, his face contorting with rage and contempt. "You must be crazy, farmer. Or maybe you just need to be taught a lesson about hospitality." He drew his pistol, the click of the hammer being cocked unnaturally loud in the silence. "Last chance, step aside." Ezra didn't move. Instead, he slowly backed into the cabin and reached for the rifle he had left, propped against the wall. The action was his answer. Vance roared in frustration and surged forward, his men dismounting to follow. "Get him! Burn the whole damn place down if you have to." The world erupted into chaos. Ezra slammed the heavy plank door shut just as the first man crashed against it. He fumbled with the bar, dropping it into its iron brackets, seconds before a bullet splintered the wood near his head. He scrambled away from the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. Vokin was a shadow of motion on the other side of the room, the iron poker held like a war club, his eyes blazing with a fire that seemed to banish all trace of his former weakness. Another shot tore through the window, shattering the precious glass pane and letting in a blast of frigid air. "Come on out, farmer." Vance's voice was a venomous taunt. "Don't make us come in there." Ezra knew they couldn't hold them off for long. The cabin was a tinderbox, and the men outside were desperate and cruel. He looked at Vokin. A silent understanding passed between them. They could not win a siege. They had to fight. He pointed to the back wall, where a smaller, shuttered window looked out toward the barn. It was their only chance. As the men outside began to batter the main door with a heavy log, Ezra worked frantically at the frozen latch of the rear shutter. It finally gave way with a groan. "Go," he hissed at Vokin, gesturing toward the opening. Vokin hesitated, his gaze fixed on Ezra. He was not a man to run from a fight, especially one being fought on his behalf. "Go," Ezra repeated, more forcefully. "Find your people. I can hold them." It was a lie, and they both knew it, but it was the only play they had. With a final, intense look that conveyed a world of gratitude and regret, Vokin slipped through the narrow window and disappeared into the snowdrifts behind the cabin. Just as he vanished, the main door splintered and burst inward. Vance and his two cronies spilled into the room, their faces ugly with triumph. Ezra didn't hesitate. He brought the rifle to his shoulder and fired, not to kill but to maim. The shot caught one of the men in the leg, and he went down with a howl of pain. The enclosed space filled with the deafening roar and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Before the others could recover from the shock, Ezra lunged, using the rifle like a club, catching the second man across the face. But Vance was too quick. He sidestepped Ezra's clumsy attack and brought the barrel of his pistol down hard on Ezra's arm. Pain, white-hot and blinding, shot through him, and the rifle clattered to the floor. Vance kicked it away and raised his pistol, a victorious snarl on his face. "You stupid, sentimental fool," he spat. It was then that the rear shutter burst open again. Vokin exploded back into the room, not running away, but attacking. He moved with a speed and ferocity that was breathtaking. He had circled around. He swung the heavy iron poker in a vicious arc, catching Vance squarely in the wrist. There was a sickening crack of bone, and the pistol flew from his grasp. Vance screamed in agony, clutching his shattered hand. The fight was short and brutal. Together, Ezra and Vokin were more than a match for the remaining conscious man. They drove him back out the door, and he scrambled after his wounded companions, who were already retreating in a panic. Vance, cradling his ruined arm, shot one last look of pure hatred at Ezra. "This isn't over, Blackwood. I'll come back with more men. I'll see you burn." Then he stumbled away, following his men into the blinding white snowscape. The silence that fell in the aftermath was profound. The cabin was a wreck. The door was splintered, the window shattered, and blood stained the floorboards. Ezra leaned against the wall, his whole body trembling with adrenaline and pain. His arm was bleeding freely from a deep gash where Vance had struck him. Vokin came to him. The fire was back in his eyes, but it was tempered now with concern. He gently took Ezra's injured arm and examined the wound. He tore a strip of cloth from one of Ezra's own shirts and, with surprising gentleness, cleaned and bound the gash tightly. Their roles were reversed. Now he was the caretaker. When he was done, they stood in the wreckage of the cabin, the cold wind whistling through the broken window. The animosity, the suspicion, it was all gone, burned away in the crucible of conflict. It was replaced by something solid and real, a bond forged not in words, but in shared risk and mutual defense. Vokin knew he could not stay. Vance's threat was real, and his own people would be frantic with worry. He walked to the door and looked out at the vast expanse of snow, then turned back to Ezra. He stepped forward and placed his palm flat against his own chest, over his heart. Then he reached out and placed the same hand over Ezra's heart. His dark eyes held Ezra's, and in their depths was a promise, a debt of honor acknowledged, a profound and deeply felt gratitude that needed no language. With a final nod, he turned and walked out of the cabin. He did not look back. He moved with a steady, purposeful stride, a lone figure merging with the immense, silent white, until he was gone. Ezra stood in the doorway for a long time, the cold air on his face feeling like a clarifying slap. He was alone again. The cabin was a mess, his arm throbbed with pain, and a dangerous enemy had sworn revenge. By all accounts, his situation was worse than it had been before the storm, and yet he did not feel despair. The oppressive weight of his grief had lifted, not gone, but shifted. The house no longer felt like a tomb. The silence was not the silence of absence, but the quiet of contemplation. He had been tested, and he had not been found wanting. He had chosen connection over isolation, compassion over prejudice. For the first time since he had laid Abigail and Samuel to rest, Ezra Blackwood felt a flicker, small but persistent, of hope. He went back inside, picked up the carved wolf, and set about putting his home back in order. The following day dawned bright and cold. Every sound made Ezra jump, his senses on high alert for any sign of Vance's return. He spent the morning reinforcing the broken door and boarding up the shattered window, his rifle always within arm's reach. The world felt dangerous, but he felt alive in it, a feeling so foreign it was almost jarring. He was a man with something to defend again, even if it was only himself and the principle he had stumbled into. It was just past midday when he saw the movement on the horizon. His heart leaped into his throat. It was not the 2 or 3 men he expected. It was a long, dark line of figures on horseback, moving steadily across the snow-covered plains toward his homestead. There were dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, a war party. His first thought was that Vokin had been unable to stop them, or that this was a different band, drawn by the scent of conflict. Or worse, that Vance had somehow fallen in with a much larger, more dangerous group. He felt a moment of pure, cold dread. He had survived so much, only to be wiped away by a tide he could not possibly fight. He stood his ground in front of his cabin, rifle in hand, a lone, defiant figure against the vastness of the plains and the approaching host. He would not hide. He would face what was coming on his feet. As the riders drew closer, he could make out their features, their clothing, the markings on their ponies. They were Cheyenne, and at their head, riding a powerful paint horse, was Vokin. He was transformed. He was no longer the storm-battered refugee Ezra had dragged from a snowdrift. He wore a magnificent war bonnet of eagle feathers that trailed down his back, his chest adorned with a breastplate of polished bone. He carried a shield and a lance. He rode with the innate authority of a leader, a man of great importance among his people. Beside him rode an older man, his face a mask of weathered dignity, whose presence commanded an even deeper respect. The 300 warriors behind them were a silent, formidable sea of strength. Ezra's heart hammered in his chest, no longer with fear, but with a profound, overwhelming awe. He lowered his rifle. Vokin rode forward, halting his horse a few feet from Ezra. The rest of the party stopped behind him, watching with unreadable expressions. A younger warrior, who rode just behind Vokin, nudged his horse forward. "He is Vokin, a war chief of the Dog Soldiers," the young man said in clear, if heavily accented, English. He was a translator. He has told our council of what you did, how you took him from the storm when his spirit was about to leave his body, how you shared your fire and your food, how you stood against the men who came to do him harm and bled for him." Vokin spoke in his own language, his voice resonant and powerful, and the young man translated. "He says you showed a brave heart and an honorable spirit. You did not see a Cheyenne, you saw a man. For this, his debt to you is a debt of our people." The elder chief, the great leader of their band, urged his horse forward. He spoke, his voice like the rumbling of distant thunder, and the young man translated again. "Our scouts found the men who troubled you. They will not trouble this land or anyone else again. Their journey is over." The finality in his tone left no room for doubt about the fate of Garrett Vance and his companions. Then, at a gesture from the chief, several warriors came forward leading pack horses. They were laden with gifts. They piled thick, rich buffalo robes and beaver pelts at Ezra's feet. They laid down great slabs of smoked and cured meat, more than he could eat in a year. They presented him with 2 fine, strong ponies, their breath pluming in the cold air. It was a fortune, a king's ransom on the frontier. Ezra was speechless, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the gesture. I cannot accept all this," he stammered. "I did only what any man should do." Vokin spoke again, a softer tone this time, and the translator smiled faintly. "He says you did what few men would. These are not payment, they are gifts of honor, from a friend to a friend. He says this small farm of yours," the young man swept a hand to encompass Ezra's land, "will now be known to our people as a place of peace. You are Ezra Blackwood, the man with the open door. Our hunting parties will know these boundaries. They will protect them as their own. You will not be lonely here." Vokin dismounted. He walked to Ezra and looked at the boarded-up window and the splintered door. He touched the rough wood of the doorframe, then looked at Ezra's bandaged arm. He said nothing, but his eyes conveyed a deep personal respect. He clasped Ezra's good arm, a warrior's grip, firm and solid. Then he mounted his horse, raised a hand in salute, and rejoined the line of warriors. With a single, unified movement, the entire party turned and began to ride away, their forms stark against the endless white. Ezra stood and watched them go, a solitary farmer surrounded by a wealth of furs and meat, with 2 new horses nudging his shoulder curiously. He watched until the last rider had disappeared over the horizon, leaving him once more in the profound silence of the plains. He stood there for a long time, the cold seeping into his bones, but it was a different cold now. It was just weather. The ice around his heart had been broken. He looked at the 2 small wooden crosses on the hill, and for the first time the sight did not bring a fresh wave of incapacitating pain. The grief was there, a dull and permanent ache, but it was no longer the only thing. It was now part of a larger story, one that included a blizzard, a desperate fight, and the astonishing arrival of friendship from the most unexpected corner of the world. He slowly walked back into his cabin. The air was frigid from the broken window, but the hearth was warm. His gaze fell to the mantelpiece. Samuel's lopsided bird and Vokin's howling wolf stood side by side, 2 small pieces of carved wood that told the story of all he had lost and everything he had just found. The land was still harsh, the winters still long, but Ezra Blackwood was no longer simply surviving. He was beginning to live again, a man who had shared his fire with an enemy and found a brother, a man who had discovered that the truest measure of a home was not its walls, but the reach of its heart. The year was 1884, and the silence on Arthur Vance's ranch had a weight to it, a physical presence that settled in the corners of his small cabin and pressed down on his shoulders as he slept. It was a silence born of loss, cultivated by isolation, and now it was as much a part of him as the calluses on his hands or the ache in his bones when a storm rolled in from the north. His world had shrunk to the boundaries of his land, a starkly beautiful and unforgiving expanse of Wyoming territory where the wind was the only constant companion, whispering through the sparse pines and carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. Each day was a metronome of necessity. He rose before the sun painted the eastern sky in shades of bruised purple and soft rose, his movements economical and practiced. He tended to his small herd of cattle, their lowing sounds a temporary reprieve from the quiet. He mended fences that seemed to perpetually sag under the strain of wind and snow. He chopped wood until his back screamed in protest, stacking it high against the cabin wall, a bulwark against the coming winter and the loneliness it would inevitably deepen. The cabin itself was a testament to a life cut short. 2 chairs sat at the small wooden table, but only one ever felt the warmth of a body. In the corner, a rocking chair, small and expertly carved, sat motionless, collecting a thin film of dust that he could never bring himself to wipe away. It had been for Eleanor and little Samuel. The fever had taken them both 3 winters ago, leaving Arthur a hollowed-out man rattling around in the shell of a life they were meant to build together. He had forgotten the sound of laughter. He had forgotten the easy rhythm of conversation over a shared meal. His own voice, when he was forced to use it in town, sounded like rocks grinding together, rusty from disuse. He was a man living in the past tense, his existence a long, drawn-out epilogue to a story that had ended too soon. The land was his penance and his sanctuary, a place where no one could see the grief that clung to him like a shroud. He asked nothing of the world, and in return, the world had seemed content to forget him entirely. It was a trip for salt, flour, and coffee that broke the rhythm of his solitude. He hitched his steady old horse, Bartholomew, to the wagon and made the long, jarring journey into the town of Redemption. Redemption was a generous name for a place that offered little of it. It was a dusty collection of clapboard buildings huddled together against the vastness of the prairie, a place of hard-bitten people who measured a man's worth by the sweat on his brow and the silence he kept about his own troubles. Arthur preferred to be an apparition there, sliding into the general store, trading his few words with the proprietor, Mr. Hale, and disappearing back into the wilderness before the dust of his arrival had fully settled. But on this day, something was different. The train had come and gone, leaving behind its plume of black smoke to dissipate against the brilliant blue sky. Near the small, sun-bleached platform, a crowd of sorts had gathered, not a welcoming party, but a flock of vultures. They whispered and pointed, their faces a mixture of cruel amusement and sanctimonious pity. At the center of their attention, seated perfectly still on a large, sturdy trunk, was a woman. She was a black woman, and her size was substantial, a fact the Gurkha's whispers made brutally clear. She wore a deep blue traveling dress, impeccably clean despite the dust, and a hat that shadowed a face of remarkable composure. She did not look at the crowd. She did not fidget or weep. Her hands, clad in white gloves, were folded neatly in her lap. Her spine was straight, her chin held at an angle that spoke not of arrogance, but of a profound and inviolable dignity. She looked like a queen on a throne of sorrows, marooned in a kingdom of dust and disdain. Arthur stopped his wagon, his hands tightening on the reins. He heard snippets of conversation carried on the wind. Sent for a bride, sight unseen. Took one look at her when she stepped off that train and sent her right back. Refused to even pay her passage back. Just left her. The words were sharp and ugly, each one a stone thrown at the silent woman. The man who had sent for her, a bitter rancher named Peterson from the South Ridge, was known for his cruelty and his vanity. Arthur could picture the scene perfectly. Peterson's smug face curdling into disgust, the casual brutality of his dismissal. The station master eventually shooed the crowd away, but the woman remained. The sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows that stretched like grasping fingers across the dirt street. Still she sat, a monument of patience in a world that had offered her none. Arthur conducted his business in the store, his mind replaying the image of her. He saw not the woman the town saw, an object of ridicule, a piece of unwanted baggage. He saw a soul who had traveled 1,000 miles on a promise, only to be met with the coldest face of human cruelty. He saw an isolation that mirrored his own, though its source was different. His was a cage built of grief, hers one built of prejudice and rejection. When he emerged from the store, the street was nearly empty. The sun was a fiery orange orb kissing the horizon, and the woman was still there, a solitary figure against the encroaching twilight. Something inside Arthur, a part of him he thought had died with his family, stirred. It was a flicker of indignation, of a decency he had inherited from his father. He could not just leave her there. He could not drive back to his silent ranch and leave her to the mercy of a merciless town. He guided the wagon towards the platform, the wheels crunching softly in the dirt. He stopped a few feet away, the silence stretching between them. He removed his hat, a gesture of respect that felt both foreign and necessary. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough. Her head turned slowly, and for the first time he saw her face clearly. It was a strong face, with high cheekbones and intelligent, weary eyes that seemed to hold the weight of her long journey. There was no fear in them, only a deep, guarded watchfulness. "Sir," she replied, her voice a low, melodic contralto that was startlingly beautiful. "The last train is gone for the day," he stated, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. "I am aware," she said, her composure unwavering. "You can't stay here." A faint, sad smile touched her lips. "It appears I have little choice in the matter." Arthur swallowed, the dry dust of the road coating his tongue. "I have a ranch, north of here. It's quiet, but it's safe. There's a spare room. You could rest there until you decide what's to be done." Her dark eyes searched his face, probing past the weathered skin and the sadness etched around his eyes. He knew what she was looking for: malice, pity, ulterior motives. He met her gaze steadily, hoping she would see the simple, unvarnished truth of his offer. He was not a savior. He was just a man who knew what it was to be alone, and he could not abide the thought of leaving another soul to face the night in such a cruel place. For a long moment, she said nothing. The wind picked up, rustling the fabric of her dress. Then she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "I would be grateful, sir." "Arthur Vance," he offered. "Beatrice Shaw," she replied. He climbed down and, with a strength that surprised her, lifted her heavy trunk onto the back of the wagon as if it were a sack of feathers. He helped her up to the seat, his hand briefly touching hers. Her skin was warm, her grip firm. The journey back was made in near total silence, but it was a different kind of silence from the one that usually accompanied him. It was a shared silence, filled with the unspoken questions and the vast, unknown territory of what came next. As the last sliver of sun vanished, plunging the prairie into a world of silver moonlight and deep shadow, Arthur Vance drove his wagon home, a stranger beside him, the crushing weight of his solitude momentarily, inexplicably lifted. The first 24 hours at the ranch were a delicate dance of distance and observation. Arthur showed Beatrice to the spare room, the one that had been his wife's sewing room. It was neat, clean, but achingly empty. He watched as Beatrice took in the bare walls, the simple bed, the window that looked out onto an endless sea of grass. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, not disappointment, but a kind of weary resignation. He left her to her privacy, retreating to the main room, which suddenly felt smaller, more crowded with memories. He made a simple supper of beans and bacon, placing a plate on the table for her. She emerged from the room a short time later, having removed her hat and gloves. She had brushed the dust from her dress and tidied her hair. She sat opposite him, the empty chair that was always Eleanor's between them, and ate with a slow, deliberate grace that made his own rough manners feel oafish. They did not speak. The only sounds were the clinking of forks against tin plates and the sighing of the wind outside. He studied her when he thought she wasn't looking, noting the intelligence in her gaze, the set of her jaw that spoke of a resilience forged in a fire he could only imagine. She, in turn, observed him, her eyes catching the way he would sometimes glance towards the small, unused rocking chair, the deep lines of sorrow that framed his mouth. The next morning, he awoke to the smell of coffee, rich and strong. He entered the main room to find Beatrice by the stove, a clean apron he hadn't seen before tied around her waist. She had found his meager supplies and made do. The fire was burning steadily, a pot of oatmeal was bubbling, and the room felt warm. It was a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice even, "I hope you do not mind. I cannot abide being idle." "Arthur," he corrected her gruffly, "just Arthur." He ladled some oatmeal into his bowl, the unfamiliar sensation of someone else providing for him, unsettling and oddly comforting. That day, they began to establish a quiet rhythm. While he was outside checking on the cattle, she set about bringing a subtle order to the cabin's interior. She found Eleanor's old sewing kit and mended a tear in one of his work shirts, the stitches so fine, and even they were nearly invisible. She washed the windows until they sparkled, letting in the stark morning light. She did not rearrange his life or intrude upon his memories. She simply polished the edges of it, her quiet industry a balm to the cabin's long neglect. In the afternoon, the handle on the old water pump broke. Arthur swore under his breath, wrestling with the rusted mechanism. He was about to fetch his heaviest hammer when Beatrice appeared at his side. "May I?" she asked softly. He stepped back, surprised. She knelt, her brow furrowed in concentration as she examined the pump. Her hands, which had seemed so delicate, moved with a surprising confidence. "It is not the handle," she said after a moment. "The pin has slipped here. It needs to be pushed back and secured, not forced." She pointed to a small, greasy piece of metal he had overlooked. Using a stick and a small rock, she expertly maneuvered the pin back into place. With a final, firm tap, it was secure. She stood and gestured for him to try. He worked the handle, and with a gratifying squeal, a stream of clear, cold water gushed forth. He looked from the pump to her, a slow feeling of respect dawning in him. "Where did you learn to do that?" "My father was a blacksmith," she said simply, wiping her hands on her apron. "One learns to see how things fit together." That evening, they ate a stew she had made, simmering it for hours with wild herbs she had found growing near the creek bed. The flavor was rich and deep, a taste of life in a place that had long been defined by its absence. For the first time, words came more easily. "You are a long way from home, Beatrice," he said, the sound of her name in his own voice a novelty. "Home was a small house in Ohio," she replied, her gaze distant. "After my parents passed, there was nothing left for me there. A woman like me, a black woman, a large woman. The world does not make many places for us. The advertisement in the paper, it spoke of a new life, a chance to build something." Her voice was devoid of self-pity, a simple statement of fact. It seems the man who wrote it did not care for the materials he received. Arthur felt a familiar anger rise in him, hot and sharp, directed at Peterson and the cruel world he represented. "His judgment is a reflection of his own smallness, not yours." She looked at him then, truly looked at him, and he saw a flicker of surprise, a crack in her formidable composure. She had expected pity, perhaps, or awkward silence. She had not expected to be defended. She had not expected to be seen. The next day, he took her to the place he shared with no one, a small rise behind the cabin where two simple wooden crosses stood against the vast sky. The wind was gentle here, and the grass grew thick and green. "Eleanor," he said, his voice thick as he pointed to the larger cross, "and Samuel." Beatrice did not offer empty platitudes or condolences. She simply stood beside him, her presence a silent, solid anchor in the swirling sea of his grief. She reached out and gently brushed a stray leaf from the smaller cross, a gesture of such simple, profound tenderness that it broke something open in Arthur's chest. He had carried his sorrow alone for so long, believing it to be his solitary burden. In her quiet act of respect, he felt a shared understanding of loss, a recognition that pain was a universal language. They walked back to the cabin as the afternoon light softened, the air growing cooler. He found himself talking, the words spilling out of him after years of being dammed up. He told her about Eleanor's laugh, how it sounded like wind chimes. He told her about Samuel's fascination with grasshoppers, how the boy could spend hours watching them in the fields. He spoke of the silence that had descended after they were gone, how it had become a living thing, a predator that stalked the halls of his heart. Beatrice listened, her attention absolute. When he finally fell silent, his throat raw with unshed tears, she said, "Grief is a house with no doors. You can never leave it, but you can learn to open the windows." In the days that followed, the windows began to open. The cabin, once a tomb of memories, started to feel like a home again. Beatrice's low humming as she worked was a gentle counterpoint to the howling wind. The smell of baking bread replaced the scent of dust and sorrow. They worked together, falling into a partnership that felt as natural as the turning of the seasons. He taught her how to spot a cow about to calf. She taught him which wild plants were good for tea and which could soothe a fever. He began to see her not for her size or the color of her skin or the circumstances that had brought her to his door. He saw her strength, her quiet wisdom, her unwavering dignity. He saw the kindness in her hands when she tended to a cut he got while mending a fence. He saw the humor that sometimes sparkled in her eyes when his horse, Bartholomew, was being particularly stubborn. He saw Beatrice, and he realized, with a startling clarity that shook him to his core, that the silence he had once cherished as a monument to his loss now felt like an emptiness he no longer wished to endure. Her presence had not erased his past, but it had made a future seem possible for the first time in 3 long years. The illusion of their secluded peace was shattered by a dwindling sack of flour. A trip to redemption was unavoidable. A knot of apprehension tightened in Arthur's stomach. Their small, quiet world was about to collide with the loud, ugly one that lay beyond their fence line. As they rode into town, the change was immediate and palpable. Doors opened a crack, faces appeared in windows. The few people on the street stopped and stared, their gazes hostile and sharp. The whispers followed them like a swarm of angry bees. Arthur felt Beatrice stiffen beside him on the wagon seat, her back becoming ramrod straight, her face a mask of impenetrable composure. He wanted to tell them to stop, to shield her from their venom, but he knew that words would only fuel their fire. He pulled the wagon up in front of Hale's general store. As he helped Beatrice down, a group of men loafing on the porch of the saloon across the street took notice. At their center was Garrett Callahan, a man whose cruelty was as well known as his thirst for whiskey. Callahan had a mean streak that he often directed at anyone he deemed weaker than himself. "Well, well," Callahan drawled, his voice carrying easily across the street. "Look what Vance dragged in. Couldn't find a bride of your own, Arthur. Had to take Peterson's leftovers." His cronies snickered. Arthur ignored them, his jaw tight, and ushered Beatrice towards the store's entrance. He could feel her trembling slightly, a tremor of fury, not fear. "She's a big one, ain't she?" another man shouted. "Must take a whole side of beef to feed her." The laughter that followed was coarse and brutal. Arthur's hand clenched into a fist at his side. He pushed the store door open, the little bell above it ringing with a frantic, cheerful sound that was a jarring contrast to the tension outside. Mr. Hale, a small, nervous man, averted his eyes as they entered, busying himself with rearranging a stack of canned peaches. The prejudice in redemption was a contagion, and no one wanted to risk infection by showing a shred of kindness. They gathered their supplies in a strained silence, the weight of the town's judgment pressing in on them from all sides. Arthur paid Hale, his movements stiff with anger. As they stepped back out into the harsh sunlight, Callahan and his friends were waiting for them, blocking their path to the wagon. "Leaving so soon?" Callahan sneered, stepping directly in front of Beatrice. He looked her up and down with a leering, insolent gaze. "Peterson said he sent you back because he ordered a woman, not a draft horse. What's it like, being so unwanted?" Before Arthur could move, Beatrice spoke, her voice low and clear. cutting through the thick air of malice. "Sir, you mistake my value with your own lack of perception. I would appreciate it if you would step aside." Callahan's face darkened with fury at her defiance. He was not used to being challenged, especially not by a black woman. "You got a mouth on you," he snarled, and his hand shot out, grabbing her arm in a punishing grip. "Maybe I ought to teach you some manners." That was the moment everything changed. For 3 years, Arthur Vance had been a ghost, a man moving through the motions of life, his heart encased in ice. But seeing Callahan's hand on Beatrice, seeing the flash of pain and outrage in her eyes, shattered that ice into a million pieces. A white-hot rage, pure and protective, surged through him. It was an awakening. He moved with a speed that belied his quiet nature. He didn't throw a punch. He simply stepped between them and clamped his hand over Callahan's wrist, his grip like a blacksmith's vice. Callahan grunted in pain and surprise, his fingers unwillingly releasing Beatrice's arm. "Take your hand off her," Arthur said. His voice was not loud, but it was deadly quiet, stripped of all emotion, save for a cold, unshakable resolve. It was the voice of a man who had nothing left to lose and had just found something worth defending. Callahan, stunned by the sudden turn, tried to wrench his arm free, but Arthur's grip was absolute. The other men took a hesitant step forward, but stopped when they saw the look in Arthur's eyes. It was a look they had never seen before, not the haunted gaze of a grieving widower, but the flinty stare of a man pushed to his absolute limit. "This woman," Arthur said, his eyes never leaving Callahan's, "is Beatrice Shaw. She is under my protection. Her name will not be spoken with disrespect by you or any other man in this town. An insult to her is an insult to me. Do you understand?" He wasn't asking a question. He was laying down a law. The silence that followed was absolute. Callahan's bluster evaporated, replaced by a sullen fear. He nodded dumbly, his eyes wide. Arthur released his wrist, shoving him back a step. "Now, get out of our way." Callahan and his men scrambled aside as if he had brandished a hot iron. Arthur calmly loaded their supplies onto the wagon, then turned and helped Beatrice onto the seat. He climbed up beside her and with a flick of the reins guided the wagon out of town, leaving the stunned and silent populace of Redemption in his dust. He did not look back. He was no longer a ghost in their world. He was a man with a purpose, and that purpose sat beside him, her head held high, her presence a silent testament to the battle they had just won together. The ride back to the ranch was charged with an energy that was entirely new. The confrontation in town had not broken them, it had forged them. It had been a crucible, burning away the last vestiges of their isolation and revealing the solid, unyielding bond that had formed between them. Arthur could feel it in the way Beatrice sat beside him, no longer a temporary guest, but a partner who had faced down the world with him. He could feel it in his own heart, which was beating with a strength and clarity he hadn't felt in years. The rage had subsided, replaced by a fierce, tender sense of protectiveness and a profound respect for the woman at his side. They reached the ranch as the sun began its final, spectacular descent. The sky was a canvas of impossible color streaks of gold and crimson, bleeding into a deepening indigo. The light washed over the landscape, transforming the harsh prairie into something soft and beautiful. The wind, which had so often sounded like a mournful cry, now seemed to be whispering a song of peace. Arthur pulled the wagon to a halt in front of the cabin, the place that had become their sanctuary. He helped her down from the seat, and for a moment they simply stood there, bathed in the warm, fading light of the sunset. He looked at the cabin, its windows now glowing with a welcoming warmth from the fire she had banked before they left. He looked at the vast, open land stretching out around them, no longer a symbol of his emptiness but a promise of a shared future. And then he looked at Beatrice. He saw the whole of her journey in her eyes, the hope that had carried her from Ohio, the humiliation she had endured at the train station, the quiet dignity with which she had rebuilt her world within the walls of his home, and the fierce courage she had displayed in town. He saw a partner, a companion, a woman of immense strength and boundless grace. He saw the person who had walked into the ruins of his life and, with her quiet presence, had shown him how to open the windows and let the light back in. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. He did not want this to be a temporary arrangement. He did not want to face the coming winter or any season after it without her. The thought of her leaving, of the silence returning to the cabin, was now unbearable. He knew what he had to do. It was not a decision born of haste or pity, but of a certainty that had been growing steadily with every shared meal, every quiet conversation, every moment of mutual support. It was the most logical, most necessary thing in the world. "Beatrice," he said, his voice husky with an emotion he couldn't name. He still held her hand from helping her down, and his thumb gently stroked the back of it. She looked up at him, her dark eyes questioning yet calm. The dying light softened the strong lines of her face, illuminating the deep well of kindness he had come to know. "I know I ain't got much to offer," he began, the words feeling small and inadequate for the immensity of what he felt. "This land is hard, this cabin is small, my past is full of ghosts, but for the first time in a long time, it feels like a place where a life could be built again." He took a breath, his heart thudding against his ribs. "I don't want you to be a guest here, Beatrice, and I don't want you to be just under my protection. I want you to be my partner. In all of it, the work, the quiet, the sunrises." He met her gaze, his own filled with a raw, unvarnished honesty. "This ain't much of a place," he repeated, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "But it could be a home, for both of us. If you'll have me, Beatrice Shaw, will you marry me?" Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow or humiliation. They were tears that glittered in the twilight, reflecting the last of the sun's fire. A slow, beautiful smile spread across her face, transforming her expression into one of pure, radiant joy. She had been bought and sold, rejected and ridiculed, but here, under a vast Wyoming sky, a quiet man was offering her not a contract, but a covenant. He was offering her a home, a partnership, and the one thing she had never been given, a choice that was truly her own. Her hand tightened on his. "Arthur Vance," she said, her voice thick with emotion, but as steady as the earth beneath their feet. "There is nothing I would like more.